really wanted to come on and like make this video immediately, but unfortunately, I was sick and in bed for a good chunk of the day. So I have only just now recovered. I've gotten back from like running my errands and doing things and just had time to process this. Okay, this has to be the single worst hot take I've seen about the Switch 2 this week. I had to say this week because there's been so many like bad takes, especially when the console was first formally unveiled. It's been like a huge maelstrom of just insane hot takes from all of these spurgs desperate to try and like paint some kind of narrative against Nintendo, right? They're trying to be the guy who kind of normalizes hating this console, and they've been throwing all kinds of things at the wall. They've been talking about the power, the controls, the lack of innovation, the launch release schedule. There's been all sorts of things they've talked about. I've seen people complain about the screen protectors. I've seen people complain about the price being too high and how no one would buy it. And then the same people like turned around and started complaining about not being able to get a pre-order, right? So there's been a lot of like weird, nonsensical things going around as of late. But this 100% has to be the worst. I can't think of anything that's more retarded than this specific take from BeatEmUps. The Nintendo Switch 2 has confusing packaging. This guy is really going out there making tweets suggesting that consumers are going to be confused about the Nintendo Switch 2 being on the same store shelves as the Nintendo Switch. Now, if this sounds familiar, it should, because this is the same playbook they did back during the Wii U and the 3DS days, where like YouTubers and journals pushed this narrative that like the Wii U and 3DS would be confusing to consumers. So instead of like doing their job and actually explaining to people the difference between those consoles, they push this idea that like, oh, it's too confusing, nobody's going to buy it. That was a big narrative, especially during the Wii U days. Like, and it's very important to note that like there was, curiously enough, no confusion about the Xbox One, which, by the way, is an objectively worse name than the Wii U. People don't like addressing this, but this has been like a huge cope when it comes to Nintendo consoles for a long time, is this idea that like people would be confused by the branding. I've seen people complain about the existence of the Wii Mini. I've seen people complain about like all sorts of like really weird, out there, nonsensical things about these products, right? It's just a gigantic cope. So you have like Woody over here, naming himself after a PKA host, the one that everyone hates. Like, you have BeatEmUps coming out here saying that like, well, people are going to be confused by the fact that it's that the packaging looks similar, and it's just such a gigantic cope. Because can you not see that there's a gigantic 2 on top of it? Like, can you not process your meager mind around this? That people aren't going to go out and buy a Switch 1 if they're specifically looking for a Switch 2? Like, you really think people are going to think it's a revision or that they don't need it? Or like what are you talking about? Nobody is going to go to a store looking to buy a Switch 2 and then come away with a Switch 1, right? It's just not going to happen, okay? It's just one of those things. Like, it's such an insane cope. And the worst part about it is that like he tries to like backtrack on it. He tried to like do damage control. He's like, well, people don't know what they want, and that like we saw some confusion when the Wii U came out. Like, bro, like I was there when the Wii U came out. Like, I know perfectly well that game store employees were straight up lying to people about Wii U, telling them that it was an accessory. Game journals were doing this, right? It had nothing to do with like what Nintendo was doing at all. It was entirely like an op on the floor of these like gaming stores. The Microsoft and Sony paid for like the store space so that PlayStation and Xbox were front and center while Nintendo stuff was shoved in a corner, right? That's the reality of the situation. Retailers had an incentive to push Xbox and PlayStation over Nintendo stuff. So like again, over the past decade, that's no longer an issue because of like the rise of like online retailers and things of that nature. The Nintendo Directs, like it's very hard for like retailers to confuse consumers like they did 10 years ago, right? But like Woody is seriously going to come out here and try and tell people that people are going to be confused by the similar looking packaging of Switch 1 and Switch 2. Like again, this is, I think, a really good example of just how desperate the Pretendo community is to keep the narrative negative, because you just know that like he really had to reach for that one. He had to like think to himself like, oh, what can I do? Like, how can I downplay this console? Like, oh, I'll just complain about like the packaging. Like, it's like, really, that's what you came up with? It's just so unbelievably stupid, especially considering like the industry narrative right now, which is not true, by the way. The idea that like the PlayStation 2 is the best selling console of all time, which by the way is not true, as I mentioned earlier. Like the PS2 is not the best selling title ever made, console ever made. That has a 2 in the title. Nobody ever was confused by the PlayStation 1 going into the PS2. And yet we're supposed to believe that people are going to be confused about the Switch 2 being a thing. It's like, it's so insanely stupid and so out of touch with reality. And like, I am very glad to see that like more and more people are calling out BeatEmUps on his nonsense. I do think it's safe to say, after this and like the debacle with like Mario and Luigi Brothership, this is my official Harmon Smith take. BeatEmUps is the worst Nintendo YouTuber right now. I can't think of anybody who brazenly lies to their audience. I can't think of anyone else who like makes mountain out of molehills and just fabricates these weird stories out of whole cloth. Like, who in the world was complaining about Nintendo Switch 2 packaging before BeatEmUps decided to release a statement about how it was confusing? Like, no. Like, you're a YouTuber. You're not a business analyst. You don't work in retail. You don't know anything about consumers. Like, nobody is going to be confused about the Switch 2. Okay? That's not going to be a thing that happens. That's why it's called the Switch 2. So retards like you wouldn't be able to push this narrative. But apparently, Woody is so retarded that he tried to do it anyway, even though Nintendo went to great pains to stop people like him from pulling this stuff. Like, it's just unbelievable. Unbelievable. This is bottom of the barrel, nonsensical trash.